This presentation is going to deal with musical form in the 20th and 21st century. What you're going to find is that when it comes to form, a lot of things stay the same. A lot of composers continue to use the same forms that were used in the classical and romantic periods. And then there are some new forms as well. And there's actually some concepts of form that have been completely redefined, where we no longer consider form in the traditional organic sense that I talked about in Lecture 5. So there are a lot of topics that we're going to go over. We're going to be talking about your conservative traditional forms and how they were used within an expanded musical language. We're also going to be talking about binary, ternary, and rondo forms. These should be familiar to you. I'm not going to go into great detail about what binary, ternary, and rondo forms are. You should already know this, so if you need to brush up on this, then that's some additional study that you should implement into your routine. We're also going to be talking about arch forms, sonata form. Sonata form is used in a different way in modern music, and some people will actually say that sonata form doesn't exist in modern music. It kind of just depends on who you're talking to. We're also going to be talking about sectional variations, which is really the modern answer to theme and variations. Continuous variation is sort of the passacaglia and the chaconne of the 20th and 21st century. Canon and Fugue is something that actually lends itself very well to 20th and 21st century techniques. And then we're going to be talking about the golden mean and the Fibonacci sequence. That's something that Bartók used quite often. At least it appears that he used it, since he didn't really talk too much about whether or not he was using a particular form. We can only analyze his music, and we can see that there's evidence of the golden mean in many of his compositions. Then we're going to get into musical forms without themes, and then we'll talk finally about non-organic forms. And that would be Stockhausen and other composers. A lot of electronic music uses non-organic forms as well. So before we get into the actual lecture, I have a few introductory points that I need to address. First, it's going to be assumed that you have a general understanding of musical form already. So if you need to brush up on your form, you can really just use any of your undergraduate textbooks to study your basic binary, ternary, and rondo forms. Now, in the 20th and 21st century, they're going to be used in a different way, and the concept of binary and ternary especially is going to be much looser, but you should still have an understanding of how these forms function. So that leads to my next point, and that's that broader terminology is going to be used for forms. So one example would be part and song forms. Those are typically an ABA form. We're just going to consider those as ternary forms. We won't really delineate them into specific aria forms and other types of forms that we might do in the classical and romantic period. So we're going to talk about how composers used conservative, traditional, classical period, and romantic period forms while expanding the musical language. There are a lot of composers, including Schoenberg, who adhered to classical forms, and many composers sought out new forms to accommodate a changing harmonic language. But the thing about classical forms is a lot of them lended themselves well to the 20th and the 21st century. And with the harmonic language changing so dramatically, it made sense for a lot of composers to continue to use the classical forms since audiences already understood these forms. So it provided a level of familiarity between the old forms and the new harmonic language. It just gave something for the audiences to latch onto. Of course, some composers went on and they created new forms entirely. So without a tonal center, traditional forms may lose some of their impact. The return to the tonic at the end of a piece typically doesn't occur in an atonal work, and that can reduce the expected impact of arrival. So one solution for this is to create the sense of a tonic in other ways, even in atonal works. Schoenberg was famous for this. He'd start a piece on one pitch class and he'd end on the same pitch class. Even though the work was atonal and trying to avoid a tonal center, the form still managed to have somewhat of a tonal impact, because otherwise the piece tends to lack logic. So contrapuntal forms, they tend to fare better with modern works, and this makes a lot of sense if you think about it, but it's largely due to the reliance on relationships and not tonality. So if you have several melodies playing at the same time, in a classical, romantic, and Baroque period piece, that would be difficult because you have to treat dissonances very carefully. But in a 20th, 21st century piece where we have liberated the dissonance, or to quote Stravinsky, the emancipation of the dissonance has taken effect, then we are able to get away with more dissonant sounding contrapuntal lines. So that actually makes contrapuntal forms a lot easier to work with in the 20th and the 21st century. Ternary form is another form that works well with modern works. The concept of this opening idea, contrast, and then a return helps to reinforce a complex coherence, concept from Lecture 5, that exists in modern music and aids in comprehensibility. Again, another concept from Lecture 5. So essentially, ternary form works well because you can have this initial idea, and I'm going to be very careful not to say motive or melody or tonal area, because that doesn't really happen in all 20th and 21st century works. But you have this opening idea or concept or timbre. It could be very loosely interpreted. The idea of motives and melodies and tonic areas, they don't exist so much in 20th and 21st century works. So we have to loosen up the idea of what form is, and we have to include more concepts for what can create unity in a piece. So that might be an instrument timbre. It might be a rhythm. It might be a simple chord. It could be a 12-tone row. There's all kinds of ideas that can be used for each section. But one of the things that will help tie the piece together in a ternary form is if you have that opening idea return at the end in some way. And then you have a contrasting idea in the middle. So this compare, contrast, and then a reinforcement of the initial idea, it's really easy for people to understand. We are very good, people in general, at recognizing patterns and comparing things to each other. You can compare almost anything. You can see the differences very easily. So that makes ternary form a good option for 20th and 21st century music. So binary form is essentially a two-part form, and really that's all you need to know for the 20th and 21st century. The concept of binary form stays the same. So it still holds its basic structure, but the tonal centers are no longer used. Now that's not to say that they're never used, but in the 20th or 21st century work, they often try and stay away from these tonal centers. Or at least they're not used in the same way as they are in other works, in classical and romantic period works. So an example of that, in a classical work, you'd have 1-5 and then 5-1 in a major piece, and 1-3-3-1 in a minor piece. But in the 20th century, these are rarely going to be used. So here's a piece that you can actually download. Hindemith, his 6 Chansons. You can download that and look at this. The second movement of this piece, titled A Swan, is actually a binary form that uses an A-B structure. And we're going to go into this in a little more depth now. First, I'm going to play the piece for you while you follow along with the score. You can download that score, pause the video, go get it, come back if you want. I'm also going to show you at least the first slide that shows the first half of the piece while it plays. So here is A Swan. So first of all, you'll notice that the A section is actually broken up into 2 parts. So you have the first A section occurring in that first measure, and then a couple measures later, in the second half of it on page 3, you've got the second A section. So we could label this as A, and then use a lowercase a to indicate the first phrase, and then another uppercase A, which you actually wouldn't need. You could just write a lowercase b to indicate the second phrase. So there's two important parts to this A section. You've got the A and the B section. And we're going to label it A as B, A and B, of course, because the A section is different from the B section. So one thing I want you to note is that there is an imbalanced number of measures between the A phrase and the B phrase. So in the A phrase, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 measures. In the B phrase, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 measures. So that's a little bit unusual. Normally we wouldn't see that in a classical period piece unless there's some measure that can be taken out, like an elision or something like that that has been added to the music to make it a little bit imbalanced. But the balance is always maintained because there's a measure that can be taken out. Now in this particular piece, it's hard to tell what measure you'd actually take out to balance these two phrases. Now, the first A section is sort of reminiscent of a sentence structure. You've got this initial idea in measures 1 and 2 that then repeats towards the end of the phrase. It's not a complete sentence, but it repeats. So in some ways, this is familiar to us because the sentence structure was something very common in the classical period, especially with Mozart. So your basic form is going to be A, and B. So now we're going to go on to the B section. This is the second half of the piece. So you notice that I labeled the first B section as C because this is a new melody that hasn't yet appeared in the piece. And then the next section towards the end is labeled as A prime and B prime. And that's because it's very similar to the opening idea, but it combines parts of the A and the B section into one melody. So we basically have an A prime and a B prime. So it's been modified, but it's based on the initial A-B idea. So you could say that this piece is comprised of a C section plus A1 and B1 merged together. Again, notice the imbalanced number of measures. You've got the same sort of concept. You have 6 measures in the first section, followed by 5 in the final section. So your form is basically, for the second half of the binary form, it's going to be B, C, and then A/B, and both those be prime, because they're slightly modified. So the question is whether or not this is in the style of rounded binary. Now you do have elements from the A section coming back in the B section to round off the form and complete it. So that does make sense in terms of rounded binary. But it also combines elements of sonata form and binary form. You could view this as an exposition for the A section, and then the C section is a development, and then it comes back to recapitulation at the end. That would make sense too. So in this particular piece, it's combining elements of both sonata form and binary form. It's really hard to know which one you are dealing with. It would be more accurate to just classify this as binary form because it really feels like two equal sections, but you could potentially analyze this as sonata form if you really view that C section as a development of the introductory material. However, the concept of sonata form is not the best solution for this because sonata form tends to have a very strong requirement for each section to be related to the tonic area in some way. So because of that, it would make more sense to analyze this as binary form. And one thing we're going to be talking about is we really don't analyze it as a rounded binary form because the way that ternary form and binary form work in the 20th and 21st century sort of eliminates the possibility of really definitively analyzing anything as a rounded binary. So we would just call it binary or ternary. And that's because the sections aren't equal like they are in the classical period and the Romantic period. So it makes it very hard to say definitively that this is a rounded binary form. This one would just be binary. So ternary form, of course, uses an ABA structure. That final A section would probably be like an A prime. It's usually modified in some way. But rather than using key centers, a ternary form in the modern period may be based on any number of criteria or a combination of several criteria. So instead of key centers, you might just use pitch level. Maybe the A sections will both start on the pitch E, and the B section will start on a B flat. Pitch level can be used instead of key centers all of a sudden. You can also do it by dynamics. The A sections might be at piano. The B sections might be at a forte or higher dynamic level. Or it might go in the reverse. The A sections might be a mezzo forte and lower dynamic level, and the B section could be forte and louder dynamic level. The texture could change. You could have really strong, dense cluster chords in the A sections, and then the B section is very lyrical and clear with single melodic lines or contrapuntal textures. The timbre could change. The A sections might be one part of the orchestra, maybe the strings, whereas the B section is just the brass instruments, something that's really easily identifiable as being a new idea. Additionally, you could identify the A sections by their melody, rhythm, or harmony, and those would contrast with the B section. You could also change time signatures between the A and the B sections. So the point is that this applies to binary form too, but our concept of what constitutes thematic material in the 20th and 21st century has drastically changed and drastically opened up. It's not to say that there aren't composers that still write using traditional techniques in the 20th and 21st century. There are. They'll typically use expanded harmonic language, maybe some suspended tonality and other features like that, but still basically have key centers. That occurs too. But some of the developments that are new in the 20th and 21st century include using different constructs for creating the idea of theme in a work, or instilling a tonal center. So in tonal music, it often comes with a balance between each section. So the A, B, and A section tend to be their own sections. They tend to be balanced in terms of length. This next point is basically saying when you have in a ternary piece, if you have two A sections, the last A section would return and it would be a complete section. But when the A section returns in part, we would actually call that a rounded binary form. But since we don't really have rounded binary and it becomes too difficult to differentiate between some pieces that might be ternary and some pieces that might be rounded binary, I've kind of already talked about this, but we just don't call it rounded binary. We're either going to call it ternary or binary. So if you have a piece that looks like it could be rounded binary, chances are it's actually ternary. So basically the distinction between ternary and rounded binary doesn't need to be made in 20th and 21st century music. And a big reason for this is because the sections do not have to be balanced. So here's another piece. You should listen to this. I think we might have a recording of this one, which I'm going to play if it's available. Okay, so that was a complete performance of this particular movement. Now this score is actually available for download at Web Campus. You can also find it on imslp.org. But this is basically a ternary form. You see your A section, your B section, and then your A section comes back again at the end. So we'd say that this has an unbalanced structure. So that A section is not equivalent in length to the final A section. And the B section isn't really proportional to either of the A sections. So this makes this piece a little bit more confusing to analyze the structure because it isn't nicely broken down into 4, 8, or 16 bar phrases. So if we look at this final section that's been identified in the box, the emphasis is on the sense of return and not a complete thematic reiteration. So if you look at that A section, the second A section at the end, it's using the thematic material from the opening idea, but it only really does it for 2 measures, and then it goes into something completely different. It just sort of ends the piece using textural chords that help bring the piece to a sense of close. It kind of slows down the rhythm and reduces the movement to end the piece a little more effectively. So this is a piece that you can kind of look at and you can see a lot of things going on. So in the first A section, you see where that arrow's pointing. Basically, this initial idea, the theme, is repeated again at the octave, sort of displaced by an octave here. And this is something that composers will do often in the 20th and 21st century, is they will repeat ideas, but they'll do it in different octave registers or by adding additional variation to the initial theme in a way. So now we're going to talk about rondo form in tonal music. So tonal music, as we should know, it typically uses a 5-part rondo form. One of the most common ones is going to be ABA, CA. Another one is ABA, BA. Those are 2 fairly common 5-part rondo forms in the classical and romantic period. You also might have the sonata rondo, or might also be referred to as a 7-part rondo, that consists of 7 parts. So that form might be ABA, C, ABA, and there's also other reiterations of the 7-part form as well, but this is the most common one. So the important thing about rondo form in tonal music is that the A themes reinforce the tonic, and the other sections are designed to provide some sort of tonal contrast. But every A section you come back to the tonic because you're always coming back to that primary key area. Everything else, all the B and the C sections, those are just diversions from the tonic, but they're still related to the tonic, and you can hear their relationship. They're usually closely related keys, if not a mode. So sometimes, as I just said, a mode was used to provide tonal contrast, but this usually happened in the C sections. So that's your basic overview of rondo form in tonal music. So now we're going to compare it a little bit to rondo form in modern music. So in modern music, tonal key centers are no longer strictly observed, but many composers still adhere to traditional tonal centers in the A sections. Now this may seem a little bit strange, but even atonal works tend to loosely follow the concept of a tonal center through the use of pitch classes. Schoenberg was known for beginning and ending some of his atonal works on the same note. That may not make a lot of sense to you if you understand the concept of atonal and 12-tone music, where you're trying to obscure the sound of tonality. But again, we're dealing with form, and we're trying to introduce really complex harmonic and melodic languages while still giving the listener something to latch onto. And Schoenberg understood this, so he'd often try and provide some cues as to where the piece began and ended. So the idea was that somehow you'd be able to keep track of where that initial E was, if that's where he started, and you'd hear it come back to the E at the end, which would give you a sense of finality and resolution at the very end of the piece, or at the end of each movement. So the next thing we're going to be talking about is arch and part forms. So arch forms can use any number of parts, but they typically read the same forward and backward. This creates sort of a palindrome, which we talked about in the last lecture with rhythm, in relation to form. So the form ABCBA is the same forward and backward. You've got ABC and then CBA. So they kind of meet in the middle and then diverge, and it just goes back to the initial pattern. It just inverts the pattern. Another more complicated one might be A, B, C. C and B would be merged, and then the A section would return. This is just one of many different ways you can create a palindrome form. You could also have like an A, B, C, B, A, where the B and A section are modified in some way. Or you could have something really complex, like A, B, C, B, A, B, C, D, where the middle section doesn't really have much of a relationship to the rest of the piece, and then you come down C, B, A. So you begin and end with a palindrome. In contrast, part forms may not resemble an arch form or any conventional form. They're kind of a catch-all for everything else. The form may be dictated by external means. This could be literary forms or even artwork. A composer might take a painting and sketch the overall design to be used as a form. So let's say you had a painting of a mountain. The composer might divide the peaks of the mountain into sections and then decide how many measures each section of the mountain should be worth, where the higher peaks may have more measures or a higher pitch, and this would be the way that they would actually create their form. There's all kinds of different literary and non-formal ways to create forms in the 20th and the 21st century, and sometimes you have no idea what the composer used to create their form. But most composers will create a form in one way or another because it acts as sort of a container which they pour their ideas into. Without form, the music tends to meander and have no sense of purpose. So sonata form in tonal music is actually a kind of complex topic, but it typically consists of 3 sections. And so I'm just going to give you the bare bones concept of sonata form as a review, and this is something that you should have taken an individual class in, or if you haven't, maybe you should consider taking a sonata form class to really learn about form. So you've got your exposition, your development, and your recapitulation. So those are the 3 main parts of sonata form, and they're typically somewhat equal in length. So thematic contrast was often used in the exposition, but there's sort of a warring of key centers that was the more important goal. So it used to be that we tried to analyze sonatas by different themes, like the A theme and the B theme, and we tried to analyze the sections based on where these themes occurred. But in the classical and romantic period, we started to find that actually it's more of a key center that defines the form of sonata form. So we went from themes to just looking for key centers. And there were almost always at least 2 key centers that would sort of fight with each other for dominance. But of course, the tonality, the tonic, would always win out in the end. So the goal was to resolve this tonal conflict between these 2 usually related key signatures, key centers. And this could be accomplished in numerous ways, which we're not going to get into, but essentially you have these 2 key centers that you have to somehow bring back into one tonic area, and that would be what would happen in the recapitulation. The development is where you go through all different sorts of key signatures. It's kind of like a fantasia in some ways, and then you come back to the tonic area in the final section. So sonata form in modern music, the battle between these key centers is no longer critical, but some may argue that without this relationship, sonata form does not exist. And so that makes sonata form in the modern period sort of a difficult concept to address, because depending on who you talk to, there may not be many pieces that follow sonata form, because one of the criteria for sonata form is this battling and resolution of key centers. So if you don't have key centers, then how do you identify sonata form? That becomes a big question. So some composers have attempted to answer this, and atonal music can use concepts of sonata form, such as Schoenberg's Wind Quintet, Opus 26. If you get that score, you look at the first measure, it comes back at the same pitch level in measure 128. So that's sort of a tonic area in a sense. The second and the third themes come back later in the piece a perfect fifth higher or a perfect fifth lower. And this is similar to our dominant tonic relationship of tonal centers. So we can still use the concept of these competing key centers, but we can change the definition of what's competing. So rather than competing key centers, we can have competing pitch classes, or we can have competing instrumental timbres. I mean, there's a lot of options for creating a very loose idea of sonata form in the 20th and 21st century. And it becomes very hard to reconcile and sometimes to identify in a piece, but sonata form can be used in a modern work. So sectional variation is essentially theme and variation. So in tonal music, theme and variation was a relatively simple concept where the music begins with a theme and then offers mostly easily recognizable variations on that theme. So an emphasis was placed on making it possible for the listener to identify the theme. And that was an important part of theme and variations. The theme was supposed to be very simple and very memorable, so that any of the variations could be easily heard in real time, because performance obviously is a time art, so that we can relate those variations to the initial theme. We can't be too complex because the listener won't be able to identify how they relate to the theme. And that was a big goal in the classical period. Sectional variation can be conceptually thought of as theme and variations, but with a much looser definition of theme and more complex variations. So since modern works may use a theme that is difficult to identify during a performance, sectional variation actually makes more sense. Your themes are often going to be hidden within elaborate chordal and melodic structures. If you listen to Carter's variations for orchestra, the variations are actually very difficult to hear, and the opening theme is really a chord that's spread out over in varying ways. So it's very hard to actually identify the theme and variation. That's why in modern music we don't really call it theme and variation. We tend to just call it sectional variation, where you have very clear sections, or sometimes not so clear, sometimes they run into each other, but there's definite sections that are related to an initial idea, but it's not always clear how they're related. So it's not really correct to call it theme and variations anymore. So we just call it sectional variation. But sectional variation is sort of the answer to the classical period's idea of theme and variations. So now continuous variation. In tonal music, you have the passacaglia, which was based on a repeating bass line, and the chaconne, which is based on a repeated harmonic progression. So again, continuous variation is a modern answer to your passacaglia and chaconne, because we're no longer using these two forms in the same way as we did in the classical period. So as harmonic language has been deconstructed, the chaconne has largely lost in favor in modern works. You're not going to see too many modern chaconnes, but they could occur. Passacaglia themes have become more complex, and they are typically non-diatonic. So you could have a modern passacaglia that uses all 12 tones or uses related 12-tone sets. That would be a modern passacaglia. It may also appear in the upper register and consist of several notes, such as the 16-note set of Crum's Voices from Corona Borealis, which is strangely apt given the time we're living in right now. All right, so Canon and Fugue. This is a device that works really well for 20th and 21st century music. So since the Canon and Fugue is largely a contrapuntal device and not strictly a form, these devices lend themselves really well to modern music, because anytime you have a contrapuntal device, it tends to be pretty easy to apply to a 20th or 21st century concept of harmonic dissonance, because the dissonance has been greatly relaxed in the modern period. So you can really subdivide Canon and Fugue into homophonic and contrapuntal forms. So So the canon has made a resurgence in modern music, and before the modern period, it was really only used in the Baroque period. It's not to say you're not going to find it in the classical and romantic period, especially if you look at music from England, but it typically was cast aside in favor of the larger forms like the sonata and the concerto for this classical going into the romantic period. So in tonal music, balancing dissonance with consonance is a major challenge, but modern music alleviates this need, which makes canon and fugue an ideal option for modern composers. So this last thing we're going to talk about is the Fibonacci sequence and the golden mean. So a lot of you have probably already heard about this, but the Fibonacci sequence is a mathematical relationship that takes a sum of the two previous numbers in a sequence and then adds them together to create the next number in the sequence. So an example of this would be 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, and it can go on. So basically what you're doing here is you're taking the 1 and the 2, adding them together to get 3. Then you take 2 and 3, add them together to get 5. Then you take the 5 and the 8, add them together to get 13, and then it just keeps going from there. So in a sense, it's sort of compounding that way. So composers, artists, and architects, they'll often use this sequence to create form. One section may consist of 8 measures and the next with 21, so that the first section that ends with 8 measures would have a very strong cadence or something to define the end of that particular section and make it very clear the section is ended. And then in measure 21, you'd have something that helps to define the end of that section again. So both sections could end with strong cadences occurring at points that line up with the Fibonacci sequence. So when you divide adjacent numbers into each other, the further you go along in the Fibonacci sequence, the closer you get to the proportion 1.618. So 1.618 is actually the golden mean or the golden ratio, and that is the goal of art, and a lot of art and a lot of music, especially in the 20th and 21st century when we're talking about music. And actually you can find this in a lot of Mozart's pieces too. So just an example, if you take 21 divided by 13, you get 1.615. That's very close to the golden mean. And then another option is 34 into 21 is 1.619, which is also close to the golden mean. So this is why you may have a piece that has 8 measures and then 21, because 21 is really close to that ideal number. So you can actually create a form using the golden mean, and some composers will do this. And so what would happen if you had a form like this, often your first section will be, you'll see that it's proportionally smaller than the second section, and then if there's a third section, it'll be even longer than the second section. And so that's a good indicator that you might have a golden mean form going on. And then you'd have to take the number of measures or time, because measures may not indicate time, and divide them in various ways to come up with your actual fraction and find out if the piece is indeed using the golden mean as a form. So this is actually the last thing we're going to talk about. You can have musical form without themes. So it may seem that a lot of modern works, especially electronic works, it's not exclusive to electronic works, but it may seem that a lot of them are without theme. The concept of theme has been reinvented. So you've got timbre, texture, register, dynamics, rhythm, articulations. I mean, anything can really function as a theme in a modern work, as long as it's employed in a way that is unique and easily identifiable. So Bartók actually uses this idea, and he uses this idea of increasing and decreasing rhythmic activity in a piece called Decreasing and Increasing. I believe that's the name of it, which is kind of on the nose, but that results in themes that delineate the different sections. So slower sections will have a decreased rhythmic activity. Other sections might have increased rhythmic activity. So you really identify the form based on how fast the music is moving. Just another way you could do this is with instruments. They can be reserved for specific sections or to indicate specific themes by using otherwise non-thematic elements. And this is actually something I talk a lot about in one of the books that I wrote, The Elements of Music Composition. It's somewhat of a repetitive book, but that's also intentional because the goal of that book is to slowly add new concepts as it develops. And it talks a lot in a lot more detail about the concept of coherence and comprehensibility and how you can actually create form using non-standard or more modern techniques. And you're not limited to the concept of motives and melodies and tonal centers. So the last thing, there is one more thing. We're going to talk about non-organic forms. So in lecture 5, I talked about the concept of organicism as traditionally having 3 parts. So you've got the whole is more than the sum of its parts. This is a review. A quality of wholeness should be present in every detail of the work. And an alteration in the part is an alteration in the whole. And so can't really get into this again, but I think it would be a good idea to review that lecture 5 so that you can get a more in-depth understanding of this if you don't remember that. That was a couple lectures ago. So again, as a refresher, Schoenberg agreed with all but the last point. He didn't think that if you made one alteration in the part, you had to go and change the entire piece. But the traditional concept of organicism required those 3 parts. So in the modern period, some composers lashed out against organic forms, and they treat each movement as a complete idea with no relationship to other parts of a work. And part of the lashing out actually had to do with World War II. The Nazis were actually a big fan of organic forms. And so because of that, the concept of this organicism in music and art became a little bit unpalatable for a while. So as a reaction to that, perhaps, a lot of composers simply said, we're not going to write organic forms, we're going to do something completely different. We're going to basically be in the moment. And Stockhausen is one of the composers that introduced the concept of moment form. He actually talked about that in a discussion where he was talking about one of his pieces and he termed it moment form. That's how he described it, because the listener isn't necessarily paying attention to motives or any of the other components that make up an organic form. They're just experiencing the music and it's not going anywhere. It has no destination. It ends as abruptly as it begins, and it begins seemingly in the middle of the piece. It's like walking into a concert midway and just hearing a small section of an entire symphony. It would sound like you missed the beginning and you missed the end. It's an incomplete work in many ways. So in these works, the listener should avoid trying to latch on to traditional elements like motives, dynamics, pitch, or rhythm, or any of the other elements that we use in music traditionally to create form and to create relationships. And the music doesn't develop or move anywhere, and it should begin and end as if capturing a moment of time that is missing the beginning and ending of a piece. So these are the basic ways that form has been used in the 20th and 21st century. And what you can use with this information is you can now go and look at 20th century works and try and classify them using these various forms and start to think about what the composer was trying to accomplish. And as a performer, if you can do that, or a composer, then you're better able to either interpret a musical work or create your own musical works with an understanding of what already exists. So as a performer, it's really important because you need to be able to get into the composer's head a little bit, and then ultimately you have to create your own interpretation. But the only way you can really get a unique interpretation without just listening to other recordings of the piece and then trying to do something different is to really understand what the composer is doing. And so by understanding all these different forms, you are in a better position to actually do that.